You've turned God's temple into a honey-baked ham, and for what? Nude wrestling? Gymnasiums?
And with those words, it's pretty obvious we're back in Maccabees, First Maccabees, chapter 2, with the second episode of our series, Righteous Revolt. I'm Joel Miller.
And I'm Jamey Bennett.
And this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy.
First Maccabees was written within a Jewish community, Jewish context. In this case, it was written about 100 BC. But this is like a Christian book, not a Jewish book in that sense, or at least rather it was adopted as Christian scripture, not as Jewish scripture.
Right.
So, Jamey, what's happening here? What's the deal?
Like I mentioned last time, that most scholars believe that First Maccabees was originally written in Hebrew. What's interesting about that, though, is we don't actually have any surviving copies of the original Hebrew. We just have people talking about it. So, and of course, also the style of the Greek seems to come from a Hebrew source text.
Yeah. Like it feels Hebrew underneath.
And even in the time of Origen and Jerome, many scholars believe that the Hebrew manuscripts had survived at least that long. So it almost seems like a little strange that a book that is so obviously Jewish was ruled out by the rabbis as to not be part of scripture.
Yeah.
And this is a clear clue on why this text was not preserved in Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
The rabbis had stopped preserving it, and it was merely the Christians who did.
Yeah.
So let's think about this from like a Hebrew perspective. I mean, the book was written to support the Hasmonean claim that they were the rightful rulers of the Jews.
Remember last time we talked about the fact that there's a tension kind of baked into the book where you have a scholar like Bruce Metzger who can say that the author was obviously just a studious chronicler, straight telling the truth. As my son Moses would say, I'm just preaching straight facts, Dad. And then yet the Jewish annotated Apocrypha uses the same adverb, obviously,
right.
These were partisans for the Hasmonean cause. The author was, rather.
Many scholars see in this book a clear evidence of pro-Hasmonean material. Like the story is told in a way that's so sympathetic to their cause.
Right.
And so when that project ultimately failed years later, you've got the rabbis on the other side of this discussion. You can see why it would fall out of favor with them.
Right. So they're the guys who are kind of like shepherding the canon. They're the ones who are saying the books that are in versus the books that are out. And they're like,
yeah,
this clearly, this is a dud. This thing falls outside because it doesn't represent our view. That's for sure.
But that said, I mean, anybody who looks at the book can see that it's intentionally biblical in its style.
Wow. Yeah.
It clearly imitates the biblical historical style that you find in Joshua and Judges, Samuel and Kings, or in the Orthodox Church, the books of the kingdoms. And there's even quotes from some of these books.
Yeah.
It's just very scriptural in its whole vibe.
It's pretty clear that the heroes of the book, your mind is meant to take you back to other biblical heroes like Joshua or David or kind of like other national heroes of the Jews.
Yeah.
And the author the narrator is intentionally crafting a story in which those guys are echoes. They are like they're in the warp and woof of this particular text.
Undoubtedly.
Now, that said, there are some interesting ways in which this book begins to kind of like deviate or differ or diverge from biblical narratives.
Yeah.
Doran Mendels is a scholar who covers this in the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha. He talks about 4 ways in which this book is not like those other narratives. For one thing, there's no real mention of the borders of Israel. It's kind of like the conquest kind of theme that you see in a lot of those other books. It's gone. It's really just about getting control back from the Seleucids. and really only west of the Jordan. I mean, that's like the only real concern here.
Sure.
There's really no problem with Jews living side by side with non-believers, which would not be true for some of those Old Testament books, those earlier books.
Right.
As long as the Jews are free to follow the Torah. It's like live and let live is kind of the vibe of the book. There aren't any prophets running around, which is interesting. If you think about, like Samuel, the book of Samuel, it's named after one of those prophets, but they're all through those books. And and we're not seeing that kind of figure here at all.
Yeah.
And then finally, there's really no focus on individual tribes or local shrines. It's like it all comes down to one people, one shrine, and then that's the temple, right?
Yeah.
So in those other books, you've got, the Benjamites and the thisites and the thatites, and they're all like these particular tribes of Israel. And we know who those guys are, right? And they live in certain pockets of Israel, and they're identified there. And they have, in certain areas, they have certain shrines or sacred places that are important to them. That's all kind of gone here. And that's really all that's left is a mixed Israel that really cares about one sacred site, and that's the temple. And of course, in our story, that's like right off the bat, that's where Antiochus goes and makes a big stink.
Yeah.
Even with those differences, though, the author is using a lot of biblical. I mean, you use the term vibe. I just use the term vibe. It's vibey with the Bible. I mean, it has that feel all the way throughout. Even like we talked about last time, the compactness of the narrative, the whole way it's structured and the whole way the style comes off, it just feels like it is the next chapter in the long history of Israel's history.
Yeah, and because of that, it's no surprise that Christians have seen that as canonical, even when Jews haven't.
Right.
Very early on, I mean, we even see there was a council in Rome in 382 that mentioned this. There was a biblical canon identical with the list that the Roman Catholic Church released at Trent.
Yeah.
Well over 1,000 years later. We see Origen talking about them. Augustine is talking about them. And a number of other councils mention or refer to these books.
Tertullian mentioned some.
It gets a little different when we talk about third Maccabees or fourth Maccabees, and we'll address that in a future episode.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to first Maccabees, even Martin Luther said it closely resembles the rest of the books of Holy Scripture and would not have been unworthy to be reckoned among them.
Wow, that's pretty strong. As long as we're talking about the canon, I got a loose canon worth bringing up here, which is the strange case of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So this is one of the Oriental, or the churches known as the Oriental Orthodox churches, along with, for instance, the Coptic Church. They're not in communion with the churches we usually call Eastern Orthodox churches, but there's common history going all the way back to, St. Mark.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how they have handled these books. And the short part of that is they haven't. Weirdly, first and second Maccabees are actually not in their canon. And I say weirdly because that counters the expectation. When you look at the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, their canon is big.
Isn't their canon much larger than ours?
Yeah, it is much larger. So it's much larger in spite of the fact that they still cut these two out.
Wow.
So it's a curiosity. I've never had that explained to me. I haven't really dug too deep into that, but it is interesting. Beyond that, they have their own Maccabean books. And like, this is curious.
Wait, there's more.
There's more. This is really curious. There's a book called Josephine, or something along that line. And then
we'll accept it.
And then there's and again, I am like a non-native, non-fluent, non-speaker, so I don't even know how to read this exactly, but there is a 1 through 3, that is books 1, 2, and 3 Maccabean books of theirs as well. And these have different storylines.
That's so fascinating.
They do not involve the same people as our Maccabean books.
Yeah.
It's kind of a mix of legend and theological reflection. And what's also curious is when they were added into their canon.
Yeah.
We're used to thinking of the canon like shutting down way early, like the apostles show up and it's like, that's it, guys. That's the end of the Bible. From here on out, we're not doing it that way.
Yeah.
It does not seem to be the case among the Ethiopian Orthodox that they think and talk that way.
Wow.
These books were added in Josephus in the 10th century.
Wow.
The 10th century, which is to say 1,000 years ago.
Wow.
So in the Maccabean books 1 through 3, which quote from Josephus, that's why I mentioned it also in this, they weren't written until the late 14th or 15th century.
Wow.
I'm taking this, by the way, from Brandon Hawk's book Apocrypha for Beginners, which is a very cursory but helpful look at some of these books. I find that totally fascinating that you would have books like this added that late and still being used. And what's also interesting is it's not just the Orthodox Church there, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church there, that uses these books, but Beta Israel, which is the Jewish community there, also considers those 3 Maccabean books to be canonical.
Wow. That's crazy.
That's crazy. With all that said, and mostly I just feel like I just dumped a bunch of curiosities on the table for us to now ignore, because I don't have a way of resolving that, but I find it fascinating.
It was fun.
Yeah. I want to go back to something Haile Selassie said. So here's my connection.
Okay.
Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia until I think 1974. He passed away in 1975. If you're a reggae fan, you'll certainly know him. But he said something super fascinating about scripture. He says, today man sees all his hopes and aspirations crumbling before him. He is perplexed and knows not whither he is drifting, but he must realize that the Bible is his refuge and the rallying point for all humanity. Can you imagine a world leader saying the Bible is the rallying point for all humanity?
Right.
In it, man will find the solution of his present difficulties and guidance for his future action. And unless he accepts with clear conscience the Bible and its great message, he cannot hope for salvation.
Jeez.
For my part, I glory in
Wow.
the Bible.
Wow.
I think all Christians, to one degree or another, can agree with that, even if we can't always agree what's in the Bible or what isn't in the Bible. So the sentiment holds either way.
That's right. We're here at chapter 2 of First Maccabees. We left Israel in a really tough spot. Very great wrath came upon Israel in First Maccabees chapter 1. But there's a shift here.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, in those days, Mattathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Jorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. And then it goes on. So we have a new character. This is Mattathias.
Yep.
He's from a priestly line. And then it introduces his sons. And it says that he has 5 sons. And after introducing these guys, so we know something important is going on here. And these guys have been introduced for a reason.
Yep.
The narrator turns to a poetic moment and says, alas, why was I born to see this? The ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when it was given over to the enemy. Her temple has become like a person without honor. Her glorious vessels have been carried into exile. Her infants have been killed in her streets, her youths by the sword of the foe. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils? All her adornment has been taken away. No longer free, she has become a slave. And see, our holy place, our beauty, and our glory have been laid waste. The Gentiles have profaned them. How should we live any longer?
Wow.
It's a devastating scene. And then in verse 14, it says that Mattathias and his sons, it says they tore their clothes, said they put on sackcloth, and they mourned.
I just want to go back to that line in verse 10. What nation has not inherited her palaces and has not seized her spoils?
Yeah.
It's interesting. We know what nation.
Yeah.
It's the Seleucid Empire under Antiochus.
Yeah.
The tricky thing there is, of course, that Antiochus is only the most recent round in a very long song of oppression that goes back to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And you can kind of hear the echo of that here, that this is now the 3rd verse of a really grim song. And that that opening line of what nation has not inherited her places. It's like all the nations have done this to us now.
Yeah.
You could read it as just applying to this particular circumstance, and it's just like an exaggeration for the sake of just like venting the grief. But there's also that echo, the historical echo that's back there as well, that this is like, it's happened again. This is devastating.
And here they are in their deepest devastation. You know, clearly something is happening from within this family. I want to point out a couple of things before we move on. We already mentioned he came from a priestly family, and that's going to be important later on in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there's been some speculation around some of the meanings of the names of his sons. Like in many books of the Bible, you will find names pregnant with meaning. One of the names most commonly rendered with a meaning is Maccabees, which means like hammer or hammerer. So this is a powerful name.
Charles Martel, right? Like in the Western context, we talk about Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the other names, though, mean like zealous or alert or cunning or lucky. Christian tradition will sometimes just lump them all in and call them the Maccabees.
They're going to need, by the way, all that zeal and alertness and lucky cunning, because
yes,
it's about ready to get real, as they say.
Yes, it is.
So in the last chapter, in the last episode and the last chapter, we talked about the fact that Antiochus was sending agents out into the countryside to force people to sacrifice.
Right.
And that's happening here. So the text says the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modin in order to make them offer sacrifice.
Oh my.
Many came when they were ordered to do so, but Mattathias said, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, which is to say Antiochus,
right,
and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors. Remember, this is happening all over the Seleucid Empire.
Right.
Antiochus has said, everybody, you're giving up on all your stuff. So the Jews are getting the shaft the same way everybody else is getting the shaft here. And these guys, they're like, even if everybody else goes along with this, he says, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors.
Wow.
Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left.
Yeah, that reminds me of when Moses used that same language, and he was talking about God's commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5.
Mm-hmm.
We see this very biblical, important, almost like a savior of the people emerging in this context.
Well, he's a Joshua, right? He's saying, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's
absolutely
like, these are the echoes. These are the biblical echoes that are right there in these passages, by the way.
And there's the explicit example of Phineas.
Right, which is coming up right here.
This is the priest from Numbers 25.
Before it goes any further, I just want to point out, I think in the teaser episode, if the Bible were directed by Ridley Scott or Mel Gibson, it would come out like this book. Well, Here's one of those scenes. I mean, this feels like something out of Braveheart or something out of Gladiator.
Sure.
He says, when he finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all who were to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. So, like, remember how we talked about how some people just were like, we're going along with it. And Mattathias, he's like, no way. And he sees this guy going up to do it, and he stops him.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking like he stops him. He stops him. He stops him dead cold. He kills him.
Yeah.
This guy is going to betray the Lord on the altar, and instead he is killed on the altar.
Yeah.
And he's killed by Mattathias.
Right.
It says that he burned with zeal and his heart was stirred. And then he's compared to Phineas, also from the Old Testament, who is noted for his zeal.
Yeah.
And the whole idea here is that Mattathias is embodying like all of Israel's sort of righteous zeal to honor the Lord and at all costs. And like, this is our hero in this chapter. This is the hero that's rising up.
Yeah.
And it says, Mattathias cried out in the town with a loud voice saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me.
Yeah.
And then they fled to the hills. So, I mean, you got to imagine that Antiochus has got like armies on the move, like patrols, groups of armed men there to support him. Mattathias has just taken his own life in his hands by basically defying the king's man to his face, killing one of his own countrymen who's getting ready to betray the covenant. And he doesn't even know if he's got a shot at this thing. He just leaves town, hoping that people will follow him. So to show you how ruthless and awful, by the way, the Seleucid soldiers are, right after Mattathias and his sons head out of town now to kind of like form a little resistance army, a French resistance against the Nazi invader, if you want to like a more modern parallel. Meanwhile, these soldiers set upon a group of, I mean, honestly, just peaceful Jews honoring the Sabbath. And they decide, when they realize they are surrounded and will die, to go ahead and die.
Yeah.
They said, let us die in our innocence. Heaven and earth testify for us that you are killing us unjustly, they say to the bad guys. And then it says they attacked them on the Sabbath and they died with their wives and their children and livestock to the number of 1,000 people. I mean, this is a massacre,
right?
A massacre of unarmed, non-resisting people. Yeah. This is like an atrocity that happens here. And this is the kind of thing that the Seleucids were just fine with. It's like, hey, you know, it's Saturday afternoon. Let's go kill some people.
And so it's not surprising that right after that, Mattathias and all of his company, when they heard about it, not only were they mourning like anybody with a heart would do when they learn about their countrymen dying in this terrible way, yet they began to burn with zeal, you know, and they looked at what was going on and they saw that these people died even in their faithfulness to the covenant, that they were keeping the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. And so it was decided among them that it would actually be better for them to even fight on the Sabbath. And they proclaimed that day, they said, let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. Let us not all die as our kindred died in their hiding places.
Yeah. Wow.
They're ready to fight.
They have joined full on. And I think I'm going to venture something here. I haven't looked this up. I forgot where I heard this. So, you know, someone call me on it if I'm wrong, but Tertullian talked about this in one place where he mentions the fact that they, you know, kind of adjudicated this question amongst themselves about keeping the Sabbath. Does like keeping the Sabbath mean that we throw ourselves in front of the enemy and die,
right,
unarmed, or are we permitted to risk our lives and save our lives rather?
Sure.
And they said yes. And so Tertullian sees in this a picture of a loosening of the Sabbath for the sake of life.
Sure.
And that's an important distinction. And of course it plays out in this story right after they make that call.
So now it's time to fight back, right? They're going to launch a counterattack. And so they've got people joining up, and it says that there's a group called the, would it be Hasidians?
Mm-hmm. Which, you know, like we think about the Hasidim or Hasidic Jews today.
Right.
I mean, this is where did those folks come from? Well, here's the story.
Sure. And I think the idea is these are strict observers. These are very pious people.
Yep.
But people are offered themselves willingly for the law. So they're coming out rallied to a cause. They are ready to fight, not just simply for political independence or something like that. No. This is sacred duty for them to fight for the covenant of their God. Mm-hmm. So they're gathering reinforcements. It says they had an army organized. You know, this may be a bit of an exaggeration. Maybe it's not a huge number.
It's kind of a ragtag group of resistors.
Right. And so Mattathias and his men began doing stuff that like you might see in other parts of the Old Testament, where they're tearing down the strongholds. They're tearing down the altars. They went through and the families that hadn't circumcised their babies for Hellenistic purposes, they performed circumcisions on the spot. And it would be a great scene for that Scorsese film. That's for sure.
It is worth saying, now that we are well into the violence, that this is a pretty violent book in a lot of ways. And, you can look at some of these elements here as highly descriptive without necessarily imagining that they are prescriptive. This is in their moment, in this time,
Sure. Yeah.
the response that they had to being attacked and pillaged and oppressed was to rally and resist, and it looked pretty brutal.
So I love the description here in verse 48. It says they rescued the law out of the hands of the Gentiles and kings, and they never let the sinner gain the upper hand. They saw this as a righteous war to rescue something that had been stolen from them.
Yeah. It's interesting that it says they rescued the law. We know that is a very broad use of that term, law, but we also have the very particular example of the law book, the texts of the Torah being destroyed. So you can imagine, almost like in a metaphorical sense here, they are snatching back that property. They are snatching back that icon of God's presence in their community, of his covenant, so that they can observe the covenant.
So now the narrative takes an unexpected turn, because we've got Mattathias and his sons and this ragtag group of folks fighting back. And in verse 49, it tells us that Mattathias is about to die. And so he calls his son near, and he starts giving them essentially a last will and testament.
Yeah. Side note, unlike Tobit's last will and testament, this one, the first one, this one is real and it sticks. There is no recovery for Mattathias from this particular situation. Just the way it starts off is really telling. Arrogance and scorn have now become strong, he says. It is a time of ruin and furious anger. I mean, he is describing he is describing what it looks like to live through war, and not just war, but practically a war of extermination, because the Seleucids will not rest until everybody has either bowed the knee to them or they're dead. And so this is a time of ruin, he says, and furious anger. But I think that arrogance and scorn is fascinating, because if you go back to who Antiochus is, who Alexander the Great is, who these kind of characters are, and the way they're presented in the text so far, these are, like, every one of them are the epitome of arrogance. Yeah. And so there's this sense in which striding across the world and forcing your will on the people of the earth by sword point, taking over their country, taking over their homeland, killing them if they resist. I mean, this could only come from profound arrogance. Yeah. And the idea that Antiochus is just going to, like, roll down through Israel, take over Egypt, which he fails at, take over Egypt, and then come back, plunder the temple a couple of times. This is arrogance on a level that is, like, profoundly high. Like, this man is delusional in his arrogance. Yeah. And so Mattathias calls that out in this speech. He's saying, these people stand for an elevation of themselves that's greater than even God. They see themselves as higher than God. Yeah. And then, of course, he's saying, but that's not us. So in this last will and testament, he starts off by, like, hammering the other side for their arrogance, for their pride. But then he turns and he says, now, my children, show your zeal for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our ancestors. Yeah. And this is interesting because he doesn't compare arrogance to humility. He compares arrogance to zeal. And that is a fascinating change, because what he's saying here is the way we are not like them is not that we're purely humble. Yeah. Not even humble at all. I mean, that doesn't even come into this. Yeah. But that, in fact, we're zealous for the law. In other words, we will not bow the knee to these folks. Instead, we're going to continue honoring the pieties that we have been instructed to observe.
Yeah.
Period. Even if we have to fight back.
Yeah.
Then right after that, he says, remember the deeds of the ancestors. So remember, we talked about this book intentionally echoes the Old Testament, intentionally echoes earlier books.
Yep.
Well, here's a whole list. I mean, this is like, he just runs through everybody.
Yeah.
And he's basically, it's like, it's Abraham, it's Joseph, it's Phineas, it's Joshua, it's Caleb, it's David, it's Elijah, it's the 3 youths, it's Daniel. He is saying and he gives very specific parts of their story. And he's saying basically, be like these guys.
Yeah.
These are your forebears. These are your icons. These are the people you are to become like and to be like. And in this moment, however you like appropriate their legacy, you must appropriate it now, because now it's all on the line. And these are the heroes that you're looking to.
And I like how you put it in terms of the Seleucid king and the arrogance, because when he makes his transition to the ancestors, this is what flows right from the faithfulness to the covenant and the law. He goes into the ancestral legacy that stands in sharp contrast.
Yep.
And each of those figures he calls out for different reasons.
Yeah, every one of them.
It would remind any Christian familiar with the New Testament, of course, of Hebrews.
Yep.
And the so-called Faith Hall of Fame. And you're going through and you're looking at all these admirable figures that we look to and that we praise and that we want to be like.
Yep. One of the things that's interesting is he doesn't point to these people purely for what they did.
Yeah.
Which is to say, they rallied and did something, amazing, which you would interpret as being an obvious thing. You would guess that would be obvious. Right. Instead, consider the case of Daniel. He points to Daniel and he says, because of his innocence was delivered from the mouth of the lions.
Yeah.
What was delivered? Now, that's fascinating because Daniel didn't do anything to be delivered.
Sure.
And I think what's happening here is Mattathias, he knows that they are outgunned. I mean, they are literally facing an army they can never hope, ever hope to defeat. They can't do it. And he knows that. So instead, they are trusting that God will deliver them. And that's why some of these characters are very specifically mentioned, because they were delivered not of their own efforts, but in fact, God's very intentional intervention on their behalf.
Yeah. And he goes on to tell them to continue observing generation to generation. So this is something that he is saying to make part of their whole way of life.
Right.
And that no matter what happens, that these are the foundational principles that keep them faithful to their God and to the covenant that God made with their ancestors.
Yeah.
And so when he says in verse 64, my children, be courageous and grow strong in the law, for by it you will gain honor. He's talking about much more than simply the fight that is right in front of them.
Yeah. He's
talking about a whole life of fidelity.
Yep. Now that basically ends the rallying part of this last will and testament. Now there's another step in it, though. He has to basically hand off the authority that he has as the leader of this movement, this resistance movement. Imagine this is the general who is opposing the other force. He's gotten a handful of people to follow him, and he's taken a lethal hit and he's dying, and he has to hand this off to his own commanders. He has to hand off this movement to his own people in order for it to be sustained.
Yeah.
And who should they be but his sons? Now, we were just introduced to these guys,
right?
Earlier in this chapter, but it's Simeon he mentions. He's wise. He says, listen to him. He shall be your father. It's Judas Maccabeus. Judas the Hammer, who
yes,
that's who gives his name to all these books.
Yeah.
He says he's been a mighty warrior from his youth. He will command the army for you and fight the battle against the peoples. And the peoples there, the Gentiles, right? Against the oppressors from the outside, the foreigners.
Right.
He says you're going to rally everyone around you who will follow the law. Like if they're anybody faithful, they're on your team.
Yeah.
Get them on your team and keep them on your team.
Yeah.
And then he says something very Old Testament, quote unquote, to use a sloppy term here in that sense. He says, pay back the Gentiles in full and obey the commandments of the law, but pay back the Gentiles in full. Like, a shocking statement to see there.
It's payback time, buddy.
Right. I mean, back to Mel Gibson, It says then that he blessed them and that he was gathered to his ancestors. He died.
That's one of those good biblical terms.
Yep. And it says all of Israel mourned for him with great lamentation. Now, just a side note on this, all Israel, it means all faithful Israel.
Right.
Not the Israelites that kind of like knuckled under and went along with the Seleucids, that went along with the Hellenic push here. These guys, all of Israel, all the faithful remnant of Israel, mourn for him with great lamentation.
Man, that's a somber close. But what happens next, Joel?
We'll be talking about it next week. What's more, we'll be sharing it in our weekly newsletter. So if you want to go ahead and subscribe, go to badbooksofthebible.com. That's where you get a teaser every week on what we're talking about, plus some background research and other elements that just kind of help flesh out the story a little bit.
Well, and Joel, we've been getting really good feedback from people through our Ancient Faith page, where people have sent us direct emails.
Yeah.
We've also had comments over on our Substack. And of course, the links to all of that is at badbooksofthebible.com.
We should, by the way, just take a second and thank all those listeners.
Yes.
What a quirky show, and people are digging it. And that's really fun. And, here we are talking about the Rodney Dangerfield of the Bible, the books that get no respect, and people are giving them respect. How fun is that? People are like, yeah, tell me more. Tell me more about Tobit. Tell me more about the Maccabees. Tell me more about all of these books. And I'm delighted to see that people are digging it.
And if you like what you hear, we'd appreciate if you would leave a rating of your choice, which of course is going to be 5 stars.
Obvi.
Oops, I forgot to mention at the beginning of the show, I quoted from Apocrypha Now by Mark Russell. It's a humorous book. It's a lot of fun. I'm Jamey Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we find out exactly what Judas did to earn the nickname The Hammer.